Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. One of the reasons that a refill of the Payroll Protection Program fund has been delayed, even as it is nearing depletion, is because congressional Democrats want more money to bail out states and cities. Because it turns out there's a lot of Democrat-controlled states and cities that are economic catastrophes and were before.
No, J.B.
the
Pritzker
pandemic.
yesterday. No, J.B. he blamed the virus. That's why we have a budget shortfall.
Folks, you don't have to be an epidemiologist to see that the virus is going to hit our budget hard. A reality that is being visited upon every state in the United States. The bottom line is this. Budget experts estimate that Illinois will have a $2.7 billion shortfall of revenues for this fiscal year and a $4.6 billion shortfall for next fiscal year.
It's different how?
Yeah, and then also that range goes up to $14 billion, which would be about one-third of the general revenue fund budget for the state. Here's the thing about that. You don't need to be a historian, JB, to know that Illinois had the worst credit rating in the country prior to the pandemic. Actually, the worst credit rating of any state in the country since Massachusetts in the early 90s. You don't need to know or have been a historian to know that Illinois had the largest unfunded public pension liabilities in the country before the viral outbreak. And so this is an area of concern in terms of continued bailing or concerns of the posture of states and localities to want the Fed to bail them out of generations of bad decisions. Because not every city and not every state has made those same bad decisions, certainly not to the extent that, say, Chicago and Illinois have. And there hasn't been enough discussion about the $4 trillion that was greenlighted as part of the CARES Act to the Fed. Robert Posen, who is a lecturer at MIT at their Sloan School of Management, had a good piece on this, arguing against bailing out states and cities. And he points up, though, one of the things that the Fed has created, one of their facilities they've created, municipal liquidity facility, purchase up to $500 billion in short-term notes from the largest cities and all states to minimize, so that's the bailout, and that's propping up the muni bond market. To minimize the program's risk, he argues the Fed should buy these short-term notes at discounts based on the insurer's financial condition and should resist the urge to buy long-term bonds from local governments. Yeah, I wouldn't take a long position on Chicago's finances, that's for sure. He notes the Fed has indicated it will base MLF prices, the prices they'll pay, the municipal liquidity facility will pay, on a government's credit. Bad news for Chicago and Illinois. Base the prices on a government's credit rating at the time of purchase, but those details haven't been announced. Another good distillation of all things Fed-related as an important part of this conversation that I saw was on Twitter, a Twitter thread from Victoria Guida, who is a financial services reporter at Politico. And so let's pick up our discussion of this with her right now. Victoria, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So begin with, you do a nice job in this Twitter thread that I referenced from a few days ago, sort of distilling the component parts of the federal umbrella here. But talk to us a little bit more about the municipal liquidity facility, what you understand the disposition of the Fed to be as compared to what Professor Posen is mentioning. And then let's get into some of the other ones, too, that relate to the private sector. But start with municipal liquidity facility.
Yeah, so this is really the first time that the Fed is going to be buying up state and large city debt. So, first point there is that this is kind of a new thing that the Fed hasn't really done before, which kind of indicates how dire this situation is. So, basically, what it would do is, as you just explained, the Fed would buy short-term bonds from either any state, the District of Columbia, or cities with more than 1 million people or counties with more than 2 million people. So, that's a relatively small number of cities in the country that would actually qualify for that. And so you've heard some controversy of people saying, well, why was that the cutoff? But the idea also is that the states are supposed to be able to request money on behalf of smaller cities as well. So that's kind of the basic setup. Is that as you said, it's based off what their credit rating was. The Fed is generally not trying to quote unquote bail out.
Well, yeah.
It's a really strange sort of situation for the Fed because the way that they like to think about what they do is lending, right? And they don't want to take losses, which is why you need the money from the stimulus bill because Treasury is supposed to cover the losses rather than the Fed, because the Fed just prints money.
Yeah, but
right?
well, right, but here, the issue is, I mean, there's a cap here, right? There's a cap of 20% of a government's revenue from the prior fiscal year, but that's a pretty high cap.
It is. So, so you're kind of getting where I was kind of going with that is you're kind of getting into, thinking of it as a bailout, even if the Fed doesn't really like to think of it that way, and just like, oh, well, we're buying bonds the way that a private sector lender would buy bonds. We're just kind of like encouraging demand, right? So if we buy municipal debt, then that will encourage others to buy municipal debt too, because we're a backstop.
Well, right, but it'll be interesting too to see how this plays out. Some of the infighting on the Hill about this, because of course even cities, much less states, are in wildly different positions, as Professor Posen points out. In 2017, the unfunded pension and employee health care obligations, or actually the percentage that was used from the budget to fund pension plans and employee health care before you even get into the unfunded portion, but it was 20% of revenues in New York City and San Antonio, but more than 60% of all revenue in Chicago and Dallas. And I think what people are really recoiling at, me being one of them, is the idea that you have cities and states that run up all these unfunded obligations, are spending a majority of their budget trying to just keep pace with obligations they clearly cannot finance long term. And now you're going to have all taxpayers in this country come in and help to provide a glide path for bad decisions that were made before the pandemic.
Right. Yeah. Well, and, I mentioned at the outset that the Fed has never done this before, and that's actually one of the reasons why. Right. It's politically fraught to decide who is deserving of credit and who is not, and the Fed doesn't like to be in that role. But this is the route that Congress has chosen, that these programs should be done through the Fed with consultation with Treasury, and so. It's pretty uncharted territory, and
let's stick,
it'll be interesting.
Yeah, let's stick there, because you just touched upon an important point that also bleeds over into the private sector backstopping the Fed is doing. Creditworthiness. That seems to be a threshold that has been significantly reduced across the board with respect to these Fed facilities they're setting up.
Right. So like the muni facilities, the Fed is going to be buying short-term and longer-term corporate debt. In general, it's supposed to only be investment-grade companies, but there are a couple of exceptions to that they've added. One is, so there's like investment-grade, and then below that is what's called speculative grade or junk bond status. And so if you were downgraded from investment-grade to junk bond status after March 22nd, if you've just been downgraded a notch, they'll still buy that debt. And then they're also willing to buy speculative grade, like bundled bonds, ETFs of speculative grade bonds. So that's kind of the two exceptions where they're kind of like venturing into buying non-investment grade corporate debt.
There's something interesting, too. The Main Street lending facility, this is for mid-sized companies. So as compared to the payroll protection program for 500 employees or fewer companies, where you have 100% government backstop, with the Main Street lending facility for those mid-sized companies, the loans that are made by participating banks, the participating banks must retain 5% of each of those loans. So that at least provides, in that one facility, that provides at least some incentive for banks to make a creditworthiness assessment, because they're on the hook too.
Right, exactly. Which is I'm sure the reason for that. It's basically so they keep 5% of the loan, and then the interest rate is around 1%. So it's about basically 4% risk that the bank is taking.
And I mean within monetary policy circles, if there even is such a thing, other than federal boards of governors, regional boards of governors for the Fed. Are they concerned at all about bringing something back that we haven't seen since basically Jimmy Carter was president, which is real pressure that drives prices, that drives inflation when we're not producing goods and services?
Yeah, so the Fed chair spoke last week, and he said that right now he's not concerned about inflation, and I think the idea there is that because of this unique situation that we're in, where economic activity has not completely but largely dried up in just a matter of weeks because we are enforcing these restrictions to combat the virus, that the Fed is basically and the government is basically filling the hole of spending that's not happening. So, you could argue that won't necessarily lead to inflation because it's just making up for all of that lost spending. But it will be interesting going forward in terms of like how we transition out of these Fed programs and back into normal economic activity. Of course, that depends also on how long all of these things have to continue. So that's definitely an open question. And people also wonder whether we might also have deflation because we're entering into a recession.
Interesting is a very gentle way to put it. Yes. What do you say in response to the charge that's being made by some that what the Fed is really doing here is propping up the market at the expense of Main Street?
Well, I don't know that it's necessarily at the expense of Main Street. As I said in my thread, I don't know that a lot of people necessarily understand that a lot of loans to you or me are driven by markets, right? Mm-hmm. So there's like a demand for bundled mortgages, and so that gives a bank incentive to lend you a mortgage and student loans and auto loans and things like that. The Fed definitely is working really hard to keep markets working, but again, we're in kind of this bizarre situation where because they can't fix the virus, they can't fix the problem, and so what they're just kind of doing is kind of trying to cryo freeze the economy until we get out of this, so that the market still exists to work on the other side. I mean, that's the idea. But how that all shakes out in terms of like who actually ends up benefiting, I mean, we'll kind of just have to wait and see how this plays out.
Yeah, it's tough to change the human condition, which it seems like some policymakers are trying to do. There's ultimately going to be costs to be borne. Victoria Guida, financial services reporter at Politico. Victoria, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Before you see it on TV,